He is currently a content developer at Ralph Appelbaum Associates, a museum design firm. And I think I was really just very interested in all that you had to say and your sense of kind of K through 12 use of this and educators' use of this material. Currently, Nafees serves on the operational committee for the SlaveVoyages Consortium, and he's also a member of the senior leadership team of the African Diaspora Consortium. His broad research interests incorporate the legacies of slavery as related to education and the experiences of African American diaspora communities. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. So this panel that we have this afternoon is entitled Middle Passages of the Indian Ocean and Asian Slave Trades, 1500 to 1920. We have 4 speakers this afternoon with Richard B. Allen, whose bio I'll just briefly read. Professor Emeritus is the editor of Ohio University Press's Indian Ocean series. He's the editor of Slave and Bonded in Labor in Asia, 1250 to 1900, and author of Slaves, Freedmen, and Indentured Laborers in Colonial Mauritius. And lastly, European Slave Trading in Indian Ocean, 1500 to 1820, and of more than 70 published articles, book chapters, essays on the social and economic history of colonial Mauritius and the Seychelles, slavery and indentured labor in colonial plantation world, and slavery, slave trading, and abolition in the Indian Ocean. He is currently writing a book on global series and is a principal investigator for the NEH-funded Global Passages, creating a public database of slaving voyages across the Indian Ocean and Asian project. We next have, where are you at, Gabriel? Gabriel. There we go. Sorry, each one of them are on the same page, so forgive me. Gabriel de Souza Miguel is a PhD student at the Department of History at Rice University. He graduated with a BA and MA in history from Rural Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. Miguel's research focuses on the history of Africa and the African diaspora in the South Atlantic. He is a research assistant with SlaveVoyages digital projects for the public production grant from the U.S., from the NEH. Global Passages, creating a public database of slaving voyages across Indian Ocean and Asia. He also works as an editorial assistant for the Journal of Southern History, which is edited and sponsored by Rice University. Next, we have Jane, there we go, Jane Hooper. Jane Hooper is a professor of history at George Mason University. Her book, Feeding Globalization, Madagascar, and the Provisioning Trade, 1600 to 1800, was published in 2017 by Ohio University Press as part of their Indian Ocean series. Study series. Her second book, Yankees in the Indian Ocean, American Commerce and Whaling, 1786 to 1860, was published in 2022 by Ohio University Press. She has also written articles about pirates, slaveries, and provisioning in the Indian Ocean. Dr. Hooper is currently a co-PI on a 3-year NEH production grant, the same digital projects for public Global Passages, creating a public database of slaving voyages across the Indian Ocean and Asia. The database will ultimately be incorporated into the SlaveVoyages database. And last but certainly not least, Matthew Hopper. Matthew S. Hopper is a professor of history at California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo. His book, Slaves of One Master, Globalization and Slavery in Arabia in the Age of Empire by Yale University Press in 2015, was a finalist for the 2016 Frederick Douglass Book Prize. He received his PhD in history from UCLA, an MA in African Studies from UCLA, and an MA in history from Temple University. He has held postdoctoral and visiting fellowships at Yale, the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton University, University of Cambridge, King's College, London, and the African Institute of Sharjah. He has received fellowships from Fulbright, the Social Science Research Council, and Fulbright Hayes, and his writing has been published in the Annals Itinerarios, my pronunciation, Africa and History in Africa, and the Journal of African Development. He is writing a book on the history of liberated Africans in the Indian Ocean. So, thank you. Thank you. Richard?
Well, it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon, and in fact, on a personal note, I'd like to mention that this is the 50th anniversary of my inauguration into Indian Ocean studies. So I'm bringing a little experience to the table, and I also want to acknowledge the fact that some of the things I'll be talking about with you today are the result of research that has been conducted under the auspices of the NEH Global Passages Project, of which I happen to be a member, and that means, of course, that I get to acknowledge the assistance and support of my 3 other cohorts, conspirators in Indian Ocean studies. And what I want to do today is to talk about the issue of interconnectivity in the European Indian Ocean and Asian slave trades. On the 14th of February, 1792, Madras Governor Sir Charles Oakley wrote to Jacob Eilbrock, his Dutch counterpart at Pulicat, about the reports he had received that slaves continued to be exported from the Coromandel coast, despite the British ban on such activity almost 2 years earlier. While Sir Charles noted diplomatically that he did not believe that, quote, a gentleman of your nation engaged in this traffic, he expressed his deep concern that, quote, foreign contractors had received, quote, great encouragement to purchase and export slaves from the factories under Pulicat's control. These foreign contractors were undoubtedly Frenchmen seeking slaves for the Mascarenes. Sir Charles's letter speaks directly to a hitherto ignored issue in Indian Ocean and ultimately global slavery studies. While recent scholarship and the creation of online databases of slaving voyages are shedding new light on the European and indigenous trades, which transported perhaps 2.2 to 2.8 million African and Asian slaves throughout and beyond the Indian Ocean between 1500 and 1900, the ways in which these trades were intertwined with one another, other commercial networks, and larger historical processes in this oceanic world remain largely unstudied, despite previous scholarship, which reveals that French slave traders frequently acquired cargoes for the Mascarenes with the acquiescence, if not active cooperation, of Dutch and Portuguese authorities in India, Mozambique, and elsewhere. More than 35 years ago, Teotonio de Souza outlined the Mahai Kamat family's role as brokers for French commercial interests in late 18th century Goa, a role which included facilitating the transshipment of Mozambican slaves from Goa to Mauritius during the 1770s and 1780s. More recently, Ernestine Carrera has outlined the informal networks created by French and Portuguese officials and merchants, which shaped economic relationships between the Mascarenes, Mozambique, and Goa into the early 19th century. Pedro Machado, in turn, has revealed Gujarati merchants' participation in the Mascarene trade during the late 18th and early 19th centuries, not only as financiers and independent entrepreneurs, but also in partnership with Portuguese merchants in Mozambique. Now, here I should make a side comment, and one of Pedro's more important arguments is to note, as a Portuguese observer did in 1770, that without Indian merchant capital, nothing happened in the Estado de India. The continuing propensity to study the British, Danish, Dutch, French, and Portuguese trades in the Indian Ocean in isolation from one another is a manifestation of the continuing propensity to treat European slave trading in the Atlantic and Indian Ocean worlds as separate phenomena, distinct and separate unto themselves, rather than as components of a complex global commerce in chattel labor. This conceptual myopia has been compounded by what I have characterized on previous occasions as, quote, the tyranny of the particular in slavery studies, by which I mean a reluctance to situate the specialized studies which dominate the field in general in more fully developed local, regional, global, and comparative contexts. Recent research highlights the ways in which the European Indian Ocean slave trades were intertwined with one another, especially during the late 18th century. Between 1770 and 1810, for example, Mauritius served not only as a base for European slaving expeditions to Mozambique and the Swahili coast to supply both the Mascarenes and the Americas with chattel laborers, but also as a refreshment station for human cargoes from Eastern Africa bound to the New World. Slaves likewise reached the islands not only on French and Mascarene-based vessels, but also on American, Arab, which are probably to say Omani, quote, imperial, quote, Indian, Portuguese or Brazilian, and Spanish vessels as well. The Mauritian notarial record is revealing the ways in which European and other slave traders interacted with one another during the late 18th and early 19th centuries in greater detail. In December 1785, for example, Port-Louis merchant Jacques Nadal and Portuguese merchant Felix Laureano Martin established a partnership to make 4 slaving voyages to Mozambique in an 800-ton Portuguese vessel, then in Port-Louis harbor, which Nadal was supposed to purchase. They also agreed that Martin, who provided 7/8 of their societé's initial capitalization, would be responsible for purchasing the slaves in Mozambique, while Nadal would be responsible for selling them after the ship returned to Port-Louis. 23 years later, Mullah Saleh ben Hassan Shah purchased the 430-ton Diana on behalf of the Imam of Muscat from Port-Louis merchant Charles Robert for 18,000 piastres, or Spanish dollars. Robert had acquired the ship, now renamed the Othmani, 2.5 months earlier for 13,500 piastres from João Ares Monteiro, a prominent Portuguese merchant and slave trader in Mozambique. As Matt Hopper has informed me, the Othmani would subsequently be condemned in 1813 by a British Vice Admiralty court after its capture by HMS Racehorse with an illicit cargo of 284 slaves on board. Other acts shed light on the complexities of financing such ventures. These include actes de grâce, in which individuals invested in voyages with the promise of guaranteed rates of return, frequently 25 to 30% per voyage, or in some cases 4 to 5% per month, depending on how long the voyage lasted. Local statements, merchant statements, when they encountered financial difficulties, ship captains' declarations when they arrived in Port-Louis, and even last wills and testaments. These documents reveal that the commercial relationships which underpin slave trading in the Western Indian Ocean stretched across the length and breadth of this oceanic world, as well as deep into the Atlantic. On October 9th, 1789, to cite one example, Port-Louis merchant and slave trader Louis Lechelle, acting for the firm of Bigot, Poulard, Boyer et Compagnie in Marseille, loaned 35,373 livres to Michel Moussard, owner and outfitter of La Constante Pauline, to cover the cost of careening and refitting the ship and purchasing the provisions needed to feed a slave cargo destined to the Americas, monies which Moussard was expected to repay at the merchant house of M. Rabot et Compagnie in Marseille on October the 1st the following year. Incidentally, the ship is going to deliver 231 Mozambican slaves to Saint-Domingue on January the 19th, 1790. 3.5 years later, Lechelle would declare that he owed more than 1.2 million livres to persons in no fewer than 6 French ports: Bordeaux, Cherbourg, La Rochelle, Lorient, Marseille, and Nantes, as well as the individuals in Chandernagore and Pondicherry in India. The creation and maintenance of such relationships are central to understanding these trades' economic impact. Garrett Knapp's study of the important commercial entrepot of Makassar provides a classic illustration of this impact, indicating as it does that slaves accounted for 21% of this entrepot's exports and imports, which total more than 4.5 million Reichsdollars both ways between the 1760s and 1780s. Information we now have about the value of VOC slave cargoes in insular Southeast Asia suggests that this activity was worth at least 47.5 to 81.7 million rupees between 1600 and 1800, an estimate which understates its true value because it reflects only slave purchase prices and not the other expenses associated with such ventures. That perhaps 50% of the estimated 660 to 1.135 million slaves who arrived in the VOC's Southeast Asian establishments did so on Malay vessels and Chinese junks highlights in turn the extent to which local and regional merchants, as well as those affiliated with the VOC, may have profited from this traffic. The creation and maintenance of such networks likewise helps to explain the mass green trade's regional economic and political impact. East African, Malagasy, and Mozambican dealers probably realized at least 3.5 to 4.7 million piastres between 1770 and 1810 from the sale of slaves destined to the mass greens, estimates which need to be increased to 5 to 8.2 million piastres if allowance is made for the taxes, commissions, brokerage fees, and other expenses that a slaving voyage incurred. The trade was also an important source of the silver coinage needed to discount the bills of exchange upon which regional trade and commerce in general depended. The mass green trade's global financial impact is suggested by estimates that it consumed somewhere between 11 and 18% of the value of all precious metal shipped from France to India during the 1770s and 1780s. The illegal mass green trade's impact between 1811 and the early 1830s was equally impressive, an economic fact of life which helps to explain why British efforts to suppress this commerce played a major role in the Maritime Kingdom's adoption of autarky in the 1820s and Omani Sultan Said's decision to establish clove plantations on Zanzibar and Pemba, a decision which spurred the importation of additional hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans to the East African coast during the mid and late 19th century. As ongoing research is revealing, this commerce was also intimately bound up with the provisioning trades, upon which European Indian Ocean establishments depended for their survival. While historians have long appreciated that plantation colonies in the Caribbean, such as Barbados, relied heavily on imported foodstuffs to feed their chattel workforces, the same cannot be said for the Indian Ocean. However, we now know that Goa depended on rice imported from the Karnataka, while the annual rice ship from Batavia supplied the Cape Colony with the rice needed to feed the Malay and Indian slaves housed in Cape Town's slave lodge. The degree to which the slave and provisioning trades were intertwined is even more readily apparent in the Mascarenes, where slaves regularly accounted for 85% or more of the island's residents, and malnutrition was a regular and sometimes fearsome aspect of local slave life. According to British Governor Robert Farquhar, famine had reduced the Mercian slave population by 5% a year between 1806 and 1810. 13 years later, Mercian Police Chief John Finnis reported that many captured fugitive slaves preferred imprisonment for marronage over being returned to their masters for the simple reason that they were better fed in prison. A report about Mauritians' daily food ration suggests that in 1825, the Mascarenes required the equivalent of somewhere between 58 and 59 million pounds of grain to meet the basic subsistence needs of the island's 126 to 130,000 slaves, quantities which could only be supplied by importing large amounts of rice, wheat, and other comestibles from elsewhere in and beyond this oceanic world. Surviving contracts with the colonial government confirmed the magnitude of this need in the 1750s, when local merchants, as well as American and Danish ship captains, agreed to supply the colony with large quantities of rice from India, Batavia, and even Manila. This period also witnessed the beginnings of a decade-long commercial relationship between Mauritius and the Rio de la Plata, during which French, American, and other ship captains exchanged African slaves, exotic tropical exports, and contraband merchandise for South American silver and provisions, especially wheat and flour. Unfortunately, the quantity of provisions imported into the Mascarenes cannot be determined with any precision. Historian Auguste Toussaint reported that 225 cargoes of rice, 104 of cattle, and 32 of salt meat reached the Ile-de-France from Madagascar between 1773 and 1809, but he did not report any information about the size of these cargoes. This trade's magnitude is suggested, however, by recent research which reveals that 76 ships transported at least 7.8 to 8.7 million pounds of rice and some 2,400 cattle from Madagascar towards the island just between 1802 and 1807. The Grande Île's role in this commerce comes as no surprise, given its geographical proximity to the islands, its significance, as Jane Hooper has demonstrated, as a provisioning stop for European ships operating in the Indian Ocean during the 17th and 18th centuries, and the increasing commercialization of cattle on the island during the 18th and 19th centuries. Other European Indian Ocean establishments likewise depended on imported provisions. The fragmentary information currently at our disposal reveals, for example, that Arakan and India's Coromandel coast exported at least 27.5 million pounds of rice to Batavia, where slaves accounted for 50 to 60% of the population between 1624 and 1678. The average size of these cargoes is 550,000 pounds. As Marcus Vinck demonstrated in his seminal 2002 article on Dutch slavery and slave trading in the Indian Ocean, food likewise played an important role in shaping patterns of enslavement in India. Vinck noted more specifically that famine played a major role in 5 of the 6 slave export boomlets that occurred along the Coromandel coast during the 17th century. The link between food scarcity and enslavement is also readily apparent in late 18th century British India, where the East India Company's philosophical commitment to act according to, quote, the dictates of humanity, prompted officials to intervene during famines to prevent children in particular from being sold into slavery and exported during such crises. Its reaction to the horrific famine, which racked the northern Sirkars between 1790 and 1793, in which there are euphemistic references to cannibalism, is a compelling case in point. In addition to adopting measures to encourage rice imports and prevent local merchants from monopolizing existing rice supplies, the Madras presidency engaged in a range of proactive measures, which included employing the poor on public works projects where they often received part of their wages in grain, directing local officials to feed people at company expense, contracting with various parties, including American and Danish captains, to import rice from elsewhere in India and beyond, and asking the Governor General in Calcutta to send as much food aid as possible. Calcutta's response would be impressive. During a 3-month period in 1791, officials in Calcutta arranged for 46 million pounds of rice to be shipped to Madras and the northern Sircars. Let me conclude my comments by noting that if the last decade in particular has witnessed a significant expansion in our knowledge and understanding about the structure, organization, and dynamics of European and indigenous slave trading in the Indian Ocean, much obviously remains unknown about this commerce of enslavement, beginning with a better sense of the number and details of the voyages which transported hundreds of thousands of enslaved African, East Asian, Malagasy, Indian, and Southeast Asian men, women, and children across and beyond the Mare Indicum between 1500 and 1900. Although the approximately 4,000 confirmed, and I do emphasize confirmed, slaving voyages that will be listed in the Global Passages database that my colleagues and I will inaugurate next year, only a fraction of the represent only a fraction of the thousands of such voyages that occurred in the Indian Ocean between 1500 and 1940. These data underscore the need for historians of slavery to acknowledge that European slave trading was a complex global phenomenon in which multiple actors and interests interacted in ways in which, in many respects, we are only beginning to comprehend. Central to such an undertaking is the need to expand our research horizons still further, a task which will require us to take off the conceptual blinders which currently limit our understanding of this global commerce of enslavement, and embrace that axiom, which is oftentimes rather feared in many aspects of early 21st century life: audeo, scire, and intelligere, pardon my Latin pronunciation, dare to know and understand. Thank you very much.
So I'd like to say that I'm very happy for being here this afternoon presenting a little bit about the results of my research on the slave trade from Mozambique, which is the title of my presentation, The Slave Trade from Mozambique, José Capela's Repertório as a Source of Information for SlaveVoyages, Indian Ocean, and Asia Slave Trade Database. So on September 15th, 1789, the embarkation Feliz Governo set sail from Mozambique towards an unspecified port on the Indian coast. 2 years later, the vessel Minerva made a similar voyage towards the port of Daman. The route taken by Joaquin also shares some similarities, leaving Mozambique on June 6, 1793, heading for the Coromandel coast. What do the trajectories of these three vessels have in common? First, all of them set sail from the port of Mozambique with loads of enslaved people. Second, they created Asian connections and took the waters of the Indian Ocean as a circulation base of a slave trade that also developed autonomously while connecting with the Atlantic. Faced with the panorama of a dynamic slave trade in the Indian Ocean and Asia, in 2023, the SlaveVoyages laid the foundation for expanding its database. The project is still under development, aims to create a public database of slaving voyages across the Indian Ocean and Asia, adding new data on the transoceanic slave trade to the existing website. To carry out this undertaking, the project relies on a 3-year digital production grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities and support from the School of Humanities, Fondren Library, and the Center for Research Computing at Rice University. Furthermore, the project has been directed by scholars such as Richard Allen, Dr. Matthew Hopper, Dr. Janie Hooper, and Dr. Daniel Dominguez. As a starting point for this project, we chose one of the first known attempts to enumerate the slave trade in the ports of Mozambique, that is the Repertório de Navios nos Portos de Moçambique no Tráfico de Escravos from 1721 to 1860. Created by José Capella, the repertório can be viewed as a first informative database about the slave trade to the Indian Ocean and Asia. Given the importance of his work for the project, this presentation will highlight the relevance of the author's work and effort for the new chapter of Slave Voyages, as well as the methodology used in his survey. I will address the approach and methodological path taken by the Indian Ocean and Asia Project for the proper analysis of the voyages raised by Capella. And I will present some preliminary data acquired so far, as well as some first conclusions these data allowed us to reach. So, José Soares Marim, better known by his literary pseudonym José Capella, was the author of relevant works on Mozambican history. He was a meticulous historian, publishing essential documents and data with thorough analysis and commentaries about the slave trade in Mozambique. The author also made primary source material available and wrote exhaustive original analysis about them. And his work spanned from the 18th to the 20th centuries with depth regarding slavery and the slave trades in Portuguese Africa and the Indian Ocean. The author calmly walks through subjects such as the concept of slavery and the Indian Ocean and transatlantic slave trade networks that crossed Mozambique. The historian also listed the main commercial agents in Mozambique who shaped the slave trade in the Indian Ocean. Details about the main slave ports that operated in the slave trade in Mozambique and the effects of that commerce in the area were also the subject of his detailed analysis. So the focus of my presentation and the focus of the Indian Ocean and Asia project was Capella's database, known as the Repertório de Navios, like I mentioned before. So in his book, O Tráfico de Escravos nos Portos de Moçambique, from 1733 to 1904, Capella reserves 50 pages for exhaustive coverage of ship manifests over 100 years. This coverage is what we call the repertório. The historian conducted tireless archival research in France, Portugal, and Mozambique to access historical sources and carry out this database. In France, the author had access to collections such as the quarterly collection of unpublished documents and works to serve the history of the French Mascarines, The Slave Trade to the Mascarene Islands by J.M. Filiot, and the Directory of French Slave Expeditions in the 18th Century by Jean Metas, highlighting the strong French role in the Indian Ocean slave trade during the 18th and 19th centuries. For the Portuguese action in the slave trade in Mozambique, Capella strongly relied on manuscripts from Portuguese archives, such as the Arquivo Histórico Ultramarino and the National Library, both in Lisbon. Finally, in Mozambique, he relied strongly on documents from the Historical Archive of Mozambique in Maputo. Beyond that, Capella repeatedly references voyages reported on SlaveVoyages, demonstrating great intimacy with the database created for the transatlantic slave trade. However, Repertório's proximity to SlaveVoyages goes further, reflected in the very choice of relevant data highlighted by the historian in his book. First, the Repertório identifies each voyage using the name of the vessel and the approximate year of arrival at the disembarkation port. Then the historian adds the known trajectory of each ship and the approximate dates of their embarkation and disembarkation when possible. Beyond that, the Repertório also makes important observations about each voyages, such as the type of embarkation, brigantine, brig, schooner, and etc., the flag of the ship, the owner's name, the captain's name, and the difference of the number of slaves between the ports of departure and disembarkation. These data make Capella's Repertório a privileged initial basis to clarify the slave voyages in the Indian Ocean and Asia. First, the similarities between the categorizations used by the historian and those employed in the slave voyages mean that Capella's quantitative effort can be easily compared with the slave trade database. And as we can see here, the categories used in the slave voyages are very similar to the categories that Capella is using in the Repertório. Beyond that, the information about the flag of the ship, the owner's name, the captain's name, and the difference in the number of slaves between the ports of departure and disembark can give us a first glance at the general characteristics of the slave trade in the Indian Ocean and Asia. Among the details we can catch from that information, we can highlight the nations involved in that commerce, the commercial agents who worked there, their connections, and the fluctuations in the number of enslaved people that crossed the Indian Ocean throughout the 18th and 19th century. As we can see, Capella's quantitative work is undeniably relevant as a starting point for any project that aims to draw a broader picture of the slave trade in the Indian Ocean and Asia. This is precisely the path chosen by SlaveVoyages in this new intellectual endeavor. To this end, methodological guidelines were created to deal with the historian's data. And I will address this methodological approach to the project here. Our first step was to create an internal database to organize Capella's information according to the interests of the Indian Ocean and Asia project. In this regard, we made a series of categories derived mainly from the data provided by Capella. Among them, we highlight the year of the arrival, the rig of the vessel, the country where the ship was registered, the name of the embarkation, the number of enslaved people carried from the ports of purchase, and so on. Some of those categories, however, deserve some explanation. First, the year of arrival at the port of disembarkation is only sometimes accurate. Since verifying this data is almost impossible in Capella's Repertório, he demonstrates a possible approximate or imputed year of disembarkation. When the voyage was reported in more than one historical source, we can also find divergent numbers of enslaved people on the ships. In those cases, the guideline was to use an inclusive approach to the data, highlighting the highest numbers. The places of slave landing and intended ports of disembarkation also raised some issues. In the first case, only destinations with the date of arrival and or number of enslaved people would be categorized as places of slave landing. On the other side, when the date of arrival and the number of enslaved people were missing, the location would be classified as an intended port of disembarkation. As I already mentioned, Capella strongly relied on the work of SlaveVoyages to build his repertoire. Because of that, the Indian Ocean and Asia project wanted to ensure no duplicate voyages entered the database slave trade. So faced with this challenge, our second step was to analyze each one of the 1,016 voyages collected from Capella's repertoire, comparing it with the already existing database for the transatlantic slave trade, thus separating all the already uploaded embarkations on the website. As a result, we found 560 voyages currently appearing in the transatlantic slave trade database, whereas 456 records could not be located on the website, counting as new possible voyages to be inserted into the Indian Ocean and Asian database. By feeding an internal database with Capella's data and comparing it with the voyages already existing in the SlaveVoyages, we could have a first overview of the slave trade in the Indian Ocean based in Mozambique. This overview helped us to delineate some preliminary results about the geography of this trade. And we will analyze these first results here. So looking at the 456 records that could not be found in the transatlantic slave trade database more closely, we discovered that 87 voyages landed in Africa west of the Cape of Good Hope or the Americas, characterized as Atlantic destinations. On the other hand, 27 voyages landed in East Africa and the Indian Ocean, describing them as voyages to be entered into the Indian Ocean and Asia database. The remaining 342 voyages provided no information on the port of disembarkation. Given the significant absence of the disembarkation port, we also decided to use the intended disembarkation port as a filter to amplify our geographic understanding of the slave trade in the Indian Ocean and Asia. So looking at the 342 records with unknown disembarkation ports, we found that 38 voyages list places in the Americas and Europe as their intended ports of disembarkation, characterizing them as Atlantic voyages. On the other hand, 129 voyages list places in East Africa and the Indian Ocean as their intended disembarkation ports, characterizing them as voyages to be entered into the Indian Ocean and Asia database. The remaining 175 voyages do not indicate the intended disembarkation ports. In addition to the number of voyages exposed, the analysis of Capella's data gives us an incredible initial overview of the geography of the slave trade in the Indian Ocean and Asia. First, our preliminary results help us highlight Southeast Africa's importance to the functioning of this part of the slave trade. This is because Capella's data locate Mozambique as the basis of the slave trade in the Indian Ocean, characterizing the ports of Ibo, Angoche, Quelimane, Sofala, Inhambane, and Lourenço Marques as the main ports of slave purchase in the region, beyond some local points in Madagascar. Analyzing Capella's data also helps us illuminate the most common disembarkation ports of the slave trade in the Indian Ocean and Asia. The disembarkation ports that appear in Capella's data reveal some interesting information. First, the presence of ports such as Bourbon, Ile-de-France, Mauritius, Seychelles, and the Mascarene Islands highlights the strength of the French presence in shaping the geography of the slave trade in the Indian Ocean during the 18th and 19th centuries. Beyond that, the presence of port cities such as Chandemargor, Puducherry, Bombaim, Bombatok, Coromandel, Malabar, Daman, Calcutta, Tamatav, and Tranquebar highlights the strength of the Indian demand for enslaved people in influencing the influx of those embarkations to the Indian Ocean. In conclusion, the research undertaken by the Indian Ocean and Asia Project, utilizing the meticulous work of José Capella and his repertório, has provided an initial and comprehensive insight into the slave trade in the region east of the Cape of Good Hope. The relevance of Capella's contribution to the project is undeniable, not only for his meticulous historical research, but also for establishing a significant connection with the already existing slave voyages, a database focused on the transatlantic slave trade. The methodology adopted by the Indian Ocean and Asia Project to analyze and categorize Capella's data proved crucial in understanding this trade's complexity and geographical extent. The creation of specific categories, comparison with the existing transatlantic slave trade database, and the identification of new potential voyages significantly enriched the understanding of the slave trade in the region. Preliminary results, like I said, highlight Mozambique's crucial importance as a hub for this trade in the Indian Ocean. Furthermore, the analysis of landing cities and intended destination ports underscores the influence of both French presence and Indian demand in shaping the geography of the slave trade during the 18th and 19th centuries. This presentation not only acknowledges the pioneering work of José Capella, but also emphasizes the commitment of the Indian Ocean and Asia Project to expand and enrich the transoceanic understanding of the slave trade. So by uniting efforts and data, these collaborative initiatives prove essential in uncovering and comprehending a crucial and often overlooked chapter in the history of the slave trade, contributing to a more complete and informed narrative of the slave trade in the Indian Ocean and Asia. So, thank you.
Thank you. How's everyone doing? Oh, I'm really loud, sorry. Waking everyone up. Okay, I'll wait for my PowerPoint to come up. So my talk actually builds very nicely on what you were just discussing. So how we look at sources. Do I have to hit next? Okay. Here's the clicker. Okay, good. There we go. Okay. So I wanted to begin just by discussing how we look at shipboard uprisings comparatively with the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. And here, I'm going to share some of preliminary findings from the database as we've worked on it, but just know that, again, it's preliminary. I want to get into this in a few minutes. I'll talk exactly about what kind of information we're building from. But I also just wanted to begin by sharing this still from a PBS documentary that came out in 2010 from a particular slave ship uprising off of the coast of Madagascar, in which the enslaved Malagasy managed to get on deck, and they murdered a number of individuals, including the translator, and I'll get into that, the title of my talk now. But they also managed to convince one of the crew members to help them sail back to Madagascar. Now, this is a failed effort. They, in the end, did not make it back to Madagascar. They shipwrecked on the coast of South Africa, and at that point, they were transported to the Cape, underwent trial, and there was significant interrogation of the people involved in the uprising by the Dutch, who were mostly concerned with understanding how exactly did this occur. In other words, what happened on board this ship to enable this uprising to occur? And this trial received a lot of notoriety as well as more recent interest. So we have an entire collection based upon this trial that's been published, as well as this documentary. And what I like about this still from the documentary, why I chose this one, there's actually a number of images I could have chosen, is that it does give you a sense of triumph, of return, of people hoping that they have returned to Madagascar here. And this is going to become a central point that I'll return to at the end of my talk. But if we continue. As we all know, I think a lot of us are aware of, the transatlantic slave trade database has been a crucial way in which scholars make sense of shipboard uprisings. And this has been the case for, I would say decades. But here, I mostly want to tap into David Richardson's work, where he looked at trying to differentiate between regimes on board vessels and the culture of the captives that they brought with them. And so trying to differentiate what are the causes of uprisings on board vessels. Does it have more to do with the European side of things, or is it more to do with the African side of things? And so here's just some of the information that I will be comparing with the Indian Ocean. And so this is looking at the number of voyages, the actual number of ships in which we have resistance occurring on the transatlantic slave trade database. So now to get into the Indian Ocean, to begin to think about what kind of answers can we get from the Indian Ocean about primary motivations here. Now, the merman was a very famous example, but I want to look at less familiar examples and some of what's involved in that. So in our work on the Indian Ocean and Asian slave trade database, beginning to do some analysis on this, we have just short of 3,000 voyages right now. And out of those 3,000 voyages, I identified 48 voyages in which we have identified some form of resistance, right? So those of you that have worked with the database, there's different forms of resistance. We have large-scale uprisings. We have multiple people trying to run away, people plotting to run away, and so on and so forth. To this, the 48 voyages, I added 15 already in the transatlantic slave trade database, because as we just heard, the transatlantic slave trade database already has some voyages from the Indian Ocean in that. So this leads to a total of 43 voyages, and out of these, 63 voyages. Out of those, 48 had full-scale insurrections on board. To put this data in perspective, since we have close to 3,000 voyages, this means we have evidence for resistance on about 1.6 voyages percent, so 1.6%. And the transatlantic slave trade database, which contains more than 36,000 voyages, has evidence for resistance on 582 voyages, which actually ends up being 1.6% as well, which is interesting. And I will add a caveat here before I get into the data on the Indian Ocean, which is that it's clear an utter representation of the data. It's very clear in the Atlantic. David Richardson acknowledges this, that probably resistance was more likely on perhaps 10% of slaving vessels. But we also know in the Indian Ocean, as we just heard, we actually have far less information. So on the table you showed, is there any discussion of resistance on board those vessels, right? So in some ways, we're very limited by the information that's available. And so you'll see that a lot of the information I'm drawing upon here is going to be heavily biased towards research I myself have collected around Madagascar. We have far less information about East Africa or even Asia, as you'll see. Okay, so let me continue. So we might imagine, based upon looking at information around the number of voyages. So again, this is not the number of people, but the number of voyages, that when you have more voyages, you likely have more resistance, right? And so here, this is a very commonly known image from the transatlantic slave trade database. You see this peak in the number of voyages towards the end of the 18th century. And if we go back to resistance data, you'll see that it roughly maps onto that. There you go. So you see the resistance and number of voyages roughly similar, right? That's not really the case when we look in the Indian Ocean. So here, frequency of voyages for which we already have data. So this is the 3,000 voyages that I mentioned. You see two peaks occurring within the Indian Ocean. One of them is in the 17th century, and the other one is towards the end of the 18th into the 19th century. So this in and of itself, I think, should be maybe surprising to people that work on the Atlantic to see this. It's a very different model than what we see in the Atlantic. The earlier phase, that earlier peak, is mostly representing people coming out of Asia. And these are smaller vessels, fewer people. So again, I'm counting here number of voyages. I'm not counting the number of people on board. And also Madagascar is part of this earlier wave. Whereas the much later wave is what we were just discussing, the slave trade mostly out of East Africa and Mozambique. And that becomes a much larger wave to the Americas as well as to the Mascarenes and other places in the Indian Ocean. Okay, so this is overall voyages. Resistance, however, and this might be harder to see, is that the peak of resistance in the Indian Ocean, for which we already have evidence for, is going to be at the mid-18th century. In other words, when we actually have fewer voyages, right? So this would seem immediately somewhat confusing and not matching what we might expect. So this was kind of my entry point into looking at this topic, is trying to make sense of this. Now, again, caveats, lack of information. This is, as I would say, if we have transatlantic slave trade database, it's been growing immensely, right? If we had a chart of the number of voyages that have been added, it'd be pretty dramatic. The Indian Ocean, we're still at 1.0, right? Like we're at the very, very beginning of this database. And so hopefully we can add more information and gather more information, especially East African, the illegal period in particular, as well as for Asia. And I will say that if we go back to looking at these voyages, that if we see any massive increase in the number of voyages, my guess is it's going to be in the later period. So just to caveat all of this. Okay, so looking at resistance, let's look at places. I like this map because it shows we're not just talking about the Middle Passage within the Atlantic. Now we're going into the Indian Ocean. And so here are some of the major places. This is not every place, right? We have a lot more locations where people were being bought and sold in the Indian Ocean. But just to give you a sense of some of the areas that we're looking at, and out of these, I decided to break down into a couple regions. So we have East Africa, Madagascar, and then I grouped together all of Asia, and I can get into why that is in a few minutes if you're interested. But out of these groupings, began to look at regions of purchase, trafficking overall. So this is out of those 3,000 voyages I mentioned. You see that more than 50% of the voyages in the Indian Ocean for which we have evidence for right now are coming out of Asian ports. So this is the earlier period that I was looking at that's fairly spread out. These, again, are smaller vessels. These are, as Richard was mentioning, not just European vessels, but these are non-European carriers as well, coming out of Asia, and mostly around the islands, Southeast Asia. Then we have close to 50% out of East Africa, which we would expect to see given how large that was. And you see that Madagascar is only about 18% of the number of total voyages in the Indian Ocean. But the frequency of resistance shows you that based upon available data right now, almost half of the number of voyages in which we have incidents of resistance were coming out of Madagascar. Now again, caveat this that we can probably find far more information about East Africa and Asia. We're working off of relatively limited data for those. As you saw, Capella does not provide rich data about resistance, for instance. So we need more scholars to go into the archives and add to this. But as somebody who works on Madagascar, I became more interested in thinking through what if we divide up Madagascar into Western and Eastern Madagascar? This makes sense for two reasons. One is geographical in nature. In other words, when merchants were coming in search of captives, they would usually sail to one coast or the other. So especially the voyages going to the Americas are coming out of Western Madagascar. And from Eastern, they tend to be going more to the Mascarenes, not necessarily all of them, but certainly there's a tendency in that way. And so then I actually combined together all of Asia because we have very few Asian voyages for which we have evidence of resistance on board. And when we do that, we begin to see that actually more incidents of resistance occurred in Western Madagascar than anywhere else in the Indian Ocean for which we have current information. And in fact, far more than we have for Eastern Madagascar. And the ones that are just labeled Madagascar, and it's probably hard to see. Sorry, if I'd known that we'd have such a big screen, I would have made bigger type on these charts. That those voyages that are labeled just Madagascar, for which we don't have the actual ports of embarkation, are probably Western Madagascar as well, just because of the timing and the national carriers that are being involved in this. Okay, so as a scholar, you begin to think, what's going on here, right? Why Western Madagascar? And to this, I would provide two answers. And so this is just zooming in about you see the blue there, that's the portion of Western Madagascar we're talking about. The first answer has to do, going back to Richardson, with what he called the slaving regimes on board the vessels. In other words, the ways in which enslaved people were being acquired in Western Madagascar. So here I might start with the voyage of the St. Michael around 1826, 1827, had shown up in the port of Morandave in west central Madagascar. They were searching for enslaved peoples for the Americas. And it's very clear from the very beginning that they were struggling not just to buy captives, but to keep their sailors alive. It turned out the sailors, as well as the enslaved people, were all dying of dysentery. And it is not surprising that very quickly there was incidents of rebellion among the captives. They were taking advantage of this much weaker sailor population. And so we have a number of uprisings, but this one is worth quoting at length. And this is a document that was provided to me by David Eltis, so I think it's worth providing here in this setting as well. And here we have this analysis of this uprising in which there's a discussion saying that we have reasons to believe that the slaves were influenced to make this attempt by the prince and the people ashore. Some of the slaves confessed that they were encouraged by some of his people to revolt against the white men, and if they could kill them, he would make them all free and give them guns and other necessaries. So this immediately suggests that we have a rebelling population that is motivated both by politics but also opportunity. And I'm going to stick with opportunity just for a minute here. So these ships that are going to the Americas, I mean, if you think about the distance between Western Madagascar and the Americas, these are incredibly long voyages, right, to begin with. So sailors are showing up already very sick, lack of food, lack of water, scurvy is a major issue. Sailors are constantly trying to run away. They're trying to steal guns and boats and make their escape. I mean, there's a constant sense of unrest on board these vessels. And at the same time, if you combine with that the fact that these European vessels, they want to fill their cargo holds relatively quickly. And we don't have European, areas on the coast here like we do in West Africa where people are being collected for sale. We have negotiations with local rulers to purchase captives in small groups throughout this entire time. And so they're spending longer on the coast, they're getting sicker and sicker and weaker, and there's more and more opportunities for captives to rebel. And so clearly there's something going on in Western Madagascar, especially given that these vessels are going to the Americas to contribute to these uprisings. But I think this is where I will agree with David Richardson, in which I say that there's more going on in terms of the African backgrounds, the Malagasy themselves here. As you can tell from this quotation, there is a political motivating factor, or some historians refer to this. This is a culture of authority among the captives, in which they are identifying leaders amongst one another. Many of these leaders of the revolt, such as the merman that I started with, described how they had been enslaved by the Sakalava king after they violated him. So these were elites in Madagascar who were part of a major state operation trying to centralize power. That often in these rebellions, there was weaponry involved, so access to guns, to spears, to various kinds of weapons that could be used, and a lot of male captives. So predominantly male captives who are taking control of these vessels. But I want to return to the political issue here. So starting in the mid to late 17th century, we had the development of a large political state in Western Madagascar called the Sakalava Empire. These interrelated rulers ruled over by 1690 the area from St. Augustine Bay in the south all the way to Masalij Mahjong in the north. And these are the major ports of slave trading to Europeans by the 1690s. And we know that there was a dramatic shift in slave trafficking with the arrival of this political state. So, for instance, Dutch vessels described showing up in 1692 and trying to buy captives from rulers in Madagascar, northwestern Madagascar. All of a sudden, the rulers only wanted firearms and gunpowder in return for captives. And despite telling the Dutch, oh, we have 6,000 people for sale, they might only manage to buy a few hundred. And the Dutch described how most of these people died after they disembarked at the Cape because they were prisoners of war. So it's very clear that warfare is generating captives, and we might imagine, as some scholars have talked about in the Atlantic, generating captives who have significant military experience as well, right? And so that's going to contribute to these uprisings. And my other take about this political state is we don't see the number of uprisings in eastern Madagascar. So some scholars say, well, the Malagasy, they all spoke a common language, so they could rebel more easily. Or they had more experience with Europeans. And it's true that a lot of Europeans, a lot of Malagasy leaders knew some European languages. Some were even of European descent by this period, by the 18th century. But in eastern Madagascar, that's the case as well, and we don't see the same kinds of rebellions occurring there. So there's clearly something going on, again, going back to this idea of this kind of political culture of authority in Western Madagascar. And so as we look at this internal development, the ways in which it contributes to uprisings, it does give us a sense that while there's a lot of things different about the Indian Ocean, which I'll get into in just a minute, there's a lot that's the same as well. And you can see by looking at the instance of resistance that these acts of resistance usually failed, as they did in the Atlantic. More people died in uprisings than successfully managed to go overboard and gain their freedom. We do have some cases in which people did manage to escape from vessels, but most didn't, or they drowned in the attempt. And they usually involved weaponry in some ways. So spears, knives, guns, and so on and so forth. But I want to return to the translator because I want to talk about what was different in the Indian Ocean. Two major points I want to make about this. The first one is that, as I said, people in Madagascar knew a lot about Europeans at this point. And in fact, as we saw from our presentations this morning, there was a bustling Indian Ocean slave trade much before Europeans arrived. So for centuries before Europeans arrived, people have been exported from northwestern Madagascar. People knew about transatlantic slavery being connected into the Indian Ocean slavery as well. So these captives on board the vessel, they had a sense of what was coming, right? They had heard of this regional slave trading. And there was a knowledge of the ways in which they could perhaps negotiate or not with the Europeans, and mostly choosing not to. So the murders were often of Cape enslaved people, so people that came from Madagascar, the Dutch brought them to the Cape and then brought them back from the Cape to Madagascar to act as translators multiple times. And we have several instances in which they were murdered by the captives in the act of an uprising. But we also have instances in which rulers would send their own personal translators into the ship to help out to negotiate with the Europeans. And those people would also be targeted for murder as well. So I think in some ways, people in Madagascar were so aware of Europeans that there was a sense of not even wanting to negotiate for their own freedom, even when these translators were being sent in for them to negotiate with. And the second way in which the Indian Ocean was distinct, and this is where I'll finish, is that people from Madagascar, as well as Southeast Asia, are coming out of a maritime tradition of long-distance travel and trade across the Indian Ocean. And we have just a few inklings of ideas of resistance on board Asian slave trading vessels that I've come across. And the two that I've come across both involve the threat of mutiny involving sailors as well as enslaved people. It's not clear that the sailors and the enslaved peoples were working together, but it is clear that there was a sense by people, either in Madagascar or from Southeast Asia, that they could return home. So unlike in the Atlantic, enslaved peoples who disembarked in Mauritius or the Seychelles, who stole a ship after they disembarked, actually had an opportunity to return to a place like Madagascar. And there's evidence that some of them did so successfully as well. So that's simply where I wanted to end, is that this resistance continued even after disembarking in the Indian Ocean in ways in which they're really grappling with this maritime tradition. So thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much to the organizers and hosts for this wonderful conference and for including me. I'd like to start with a story, building on the papers that have already been presented this afternoon. I'll end by making some connections. On August 10th, 1860, the HMS Brisk, a British Royal Navy sloop of war patrolling the waters between Mozambique and Madagascar, spotted the Cuban slave ship Manuela, sailing from Zanzibar to Havana. The Brisk pursued and captured the slave ship, and on boarding, discovered that the Manuela was carrying 846 African captives, making it the largest slave ship ever captured in the Indian Ocean, and one of the largest slave ships ever captured by the British Royal Navy. The African captives found on board were taken to Mauritius, where they became known as liberated Africans. That's the term that the British officials applied to Africans who were removed from slave ships by the Royal Navy. But despite the misleading nomenclature, recaptive Africans were not released on the island to live independently. Instead, they were placed into indentured servitude as laborers, domestic servants, apprentices to trade, for terms of usually 14 years. The captures aboard the Manuela were part of a global phenomenon. Between 1808 and 1897, the British Royal Navy captured more than 2,800 slave ships and removed more than 188,000 enslaved Africans from vessels in the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. More than 20,000 of those Africans were captured aboard slave ships like the Manuela in the Indian Ocean. Although Manuela is one of the last European vessels, most of the rest would be Arab dhows. As in the Atlantic world, liberated Africans in the Indian Ocean were never simply released near their point of capture, out of fear that they might be re-enslaved or massacred. Instead, they were taken to British ports with the closest Vice Admiralty court of adjudication, where their ships could be tried and condemned, and where Africans could be registered and placed into indenture contracts. And although the Act of Abolition may have envisioned indenture as a method to provide training and marketable skills that would enable these captive Africans to earn an independent living in a colonial economy, in reality, most of the liberated Africans were placed into menial positions as domestic servants or agricultural laborers, just as if they had been enslaved. Today, an original copy of the Register of Liberated Africans from the Manuela is preserved at the Mahatma Gandhi Institute in Mauritius, and it contains personal information about each of the captives. For example, one 9-year-old boy who is given the colonial name of Jacob is listed as 4 feet tall. He's 9 years old, and the register tells us his birth name was Nuangumamula, and his father's name was Chembinde. And we're also told that he had a distinctive brand that had been seared into his flesh in the shape of a capital letter G. And he became engaged to Mr. Courson as a domestic servant. As part of a wider study of liberated Africans in the Indian Ocean world, I'm using registers like this, much as David Eltis and Daniel Dominguez have done, the African Names Project, or African Origins Project, to try to trace the life histories of some of those people who were removed from slave ships in the Indian Ocean. They're referred to as liberated Africans, and they're part of a global phenomenon. Here's an image from 1868 for a ship that image you may have seen in other contexts, called the HMS Daphne. Large groups of captives were sometimes photographed aboard ships like the Daphne, or in this one for the HMS London. And they're part of a global phenomenon. We're all showing images from the wonderful Yale Atlas. Here's one of my favorites. This one will have to be, I think, updated a bit, given some new research that's been done. But about half of those captives were taken to Sierra Leone. But the rest were taken to port cities in the Caribbean and in Brazil and even in the Indian Ocean. And in the initial years, they're taken to the Cape of Good Hope in Mauritius. But in later years, they're also taken to other locations. So in some ways, I'm following on some of my earlier research that was part of my first book, which came out in 2015, which was on the slave trade from East Africa to Arabia in the 19th century. And I was interested in the kind of labor that enslaved Africans were doing, and that included things like pearling. But in this project, I'm doing sort of a follow-up study that instead looks at those people who never arrived in the Gulf, never arrived in Arabia, because their voyages were interrupted by the Royal Navy. And they were taken to places around the Indian Ocean, Britain's Indian Ocean empire. And so there's some fascinating overlap with the Atlantic, but there's also some things that are distinct. So the Act of Abolition in 1807 equipped the Royal Navy to begin making these captures. And the very first captures were made off the coast of West Africa, but within weeks, they were also making captures off of the coast of South Africa. And some of those earliest captives were taken to the Cape of Good Hope and then later to Mauritius. So in the Indian Ocean, there are 10 places where liberated Africans are taken, and I'll say something about each of them just briefly this afternoon. And then hopefully you'll be able to see the larger book project when it eventually is published. Just like in the Atlantic, these vessels in the Indian Ocean were usually issued warning shots. They were fired upon, or they used other signals to get them to lower their sails. When they didn't, sometimes violent resistance would then occur. But the ships were then boarded by outboats, by longboats, rowboats of the Royal Navy, and then they would be boarded. In many cases, these were Arab dhows that put up fierce resistance. Sometimes the ships would be run ashore. But just as in the Atlantic, they would then be taken, either towed or destroyed and the captives on board relocated, but they'd be taken to a port of adjudication, a vice admiralty court at a place like Aden or Zanzibar, Mauritius, or the Cape of Good Hope. Sometimes the ships would be run ashore in an attempt to corral the captives who survived and only to ship them again at a later time. And this was an attempt to evade the Royal Navy because they had no jurisdiction on land. After they arrived at the port of adjudication, a trial would occur in which people would be interviewed, including a translator or the captives themselves. Sometimes the slave traders themselves would be interviewed. And then a determination would be made about whether the ship was to be condemned or restored. And condemned ships in the Indian Ocean were often destroyed, deemed to be unseaworthy, and then liberated Africans were not always released at the point where they were, where the ship originally arrived. The port of adjudication might be Zanzibar, for example, but then the earliest ships to be taken to the Seychelles were then relocated, and the liberated Africans were then taken there, beginning in 1861. And once they arrived, they would be registered, just like in Sierra Leone. And so the wonderful African Names or African Origins project that's currently on Slave Voyages involved the painstaking work of transcribing names from registers. We have similar registers for the Indian Ocean. They're just scattered around 10 different locations in the Indian Ocean. And they provide the same information that the Sierra Leone registers provide, including those captives' ages, sex, sometimes ethnonyms, very rough ethnonyms, stature in feet and inches, and even sometimes distinguishing marks, including brands and other forms of body modification. After they're registered, they're then indentured, and these contracts of indenture in the Indian Ocean are almost always for the maximum allowable 14 years. So these indenture contracts are never between the enslaved Africans themselves, but between the collector of customs, who's tasked with this work at the Cape of Good Hope and Mauritius and elsewhere, and the person to whom they're indentured. They have no say in the matter. And they're very often tasked with doing menial work that looks a lot like enslaved labor in this period. Domestic servants, field hands working often in the production of cash crops, just as they might have done had they been enslaved. So in the Indian Ocean, they're taken to 10 different locations. In the earliest years, they're taken to Cape Town and Mauritius. A small number is also taken to Reunion. And then in later years, they're taken to places like Zanzibar and the Seychelles, Mombasa, Aden, Bombay, and even a small number taken to Muscat. So in the earliest years, something around 5,000 liberated Africans are taken off of slave ships and transported to the Cape of Good Hope and to Mauritius. There's about an 11-year period in which no slave ships are captured by the Royal Navy in the Indian Ocean at all. And then there's a revival of these captures after the Palmerston Act in 1839. And David Eltis talks about this in the Atlas, of course, after the 1839. Many more captures are made in the Atlantic because now the British Royal Navy is authorized to go south of the equator against international law, but they're doing it nevertheless. So they're taken to these 10 locations. So I'll just say something very briefly about each of these sites. So the Cape of Good Hope, which was one of the earliest sites liberated Africans has taken, has been researched in detail by scholars like Chris Saunders. And they primarily involve ships that either foundered right there on the coast of the Cape, or they were captured in the Mozambique Channel, then transported rather long distances to the Cape of Good Hope. And this sometimes involved massive loss of life between the point of capture and the point of release. We don't have detailed register for the earlier period at the Western Cape Archives, but we do have this incredible volume that was produced by William Swan Field, the collector of customs in the 1840s and early 1850s. And he took great pains to detail, and he called this one of the most odious tasks of his task, but also one of the most essential. He hated to do it, but he also recognized it was absolutely essential because people would often abscond from their indentures and try to pass themselves off as under a new identity. And these registers served as a method of surveillance for figuring out who was really whom based on the register. So very detailed inscriptions or descriptions of their markings allowed these permanent markings to be used as identifiers, sort of like a passport or a driver's license would be used. And this is in an era before photography. And so what's remarkable about William Swan Field's registers and some of the registers produced in the 1820s in Mauritius is that they also provide some hints about people's ethnicity or their points of origin. And they could be compared with 19th century ethnographies, both in East Africa as well as in Brazil, where ethnographers were very interested in Mozambican ethnic groups' facial scarification and patterns of body modification. These provide historians with clues about people's origins, and they could be used alongside names, just like with the African names database. So we can look for clues about whether people might be Makonde, for example, or Ngindo, whether their patterns of facial scarification described in these registers line up with ethnic groups we know were using similar patterns in the 19th century, in southern Tanzania and northern Mozambique in particular. But we also have some clues to unlock the mysteries of what these brands mean. Very often we find in the registers people who have seared onto their flesh initials, letters, and it's sometimes mysterious what those letters represent. But thankfully, just as for the Atlantic, for at least a few of the Indian Ocean vessels, we also have the prize papers, the papers that were seized on board those slave ships. And very often they include correspondence that allows us to identify what the letter FL or the letter G means. And we know actually the merchant who was consigning goods, also branded with their brand, with their initial, in their name in order to receive captives on their arrival in Brazil. In Mauritius, we also have some detailed registers. And so if we're going to tell the story of enslaved people, it really starts with a name, right? If we want to say something biographical, having someone's name is absolutely essential. So the registers allow for us to see details not only about people's ethnicity, but also their names, and that allows us to then trace the people to whom they're indentured and perhaps know where to look for the next clue about what happens in their lives. Perhaps they might marry or pass away or have children, and it's possible that their civil records might survive, but it really starts with the name. And so we have many of these registers that are preserved in London that aren't available in the Indian Ocean archives. And then there are, of course, these ones at Mauritius from the 1860s, which are actually remarkably well preserved alongside the registers of indentured South Asian laborers who were arriving at the same time. But as I mentioned, most of the labor these people were doing after they're indentured looks a lot like the kind of labor enslaved people were doing. So, for example, from one ship that arrives in 1861, of 226 captives who survived to be released, 168 of them, or 74%, are enlisted to be domestic servants. And the indenture contracts have survived, in some cases intact. So a ship called the Aglé in 1815, we have every single contract for every single person who has survived. And we can read these in detail and know exactly to whom they were indentured, many of them British colonial officials, and the kind of work that they were to be doing. We can also say something about the gender ratio, so 3 males to 1 female in the case of liberated Africans taken to Mauritius between 1813 and 1827. But these 2 places in the southern Indian Ocean are just 2 of the 10 places they're taken. I won't have time to go into much detail of the others, but I'll just quickly say something about Bombay, where the Church Missionary Society established a mission at Saharanpur, the Nasik asylum. And many of these liberated Africans who were taken there ended up being relocated to Mombasa. And some of them ended up accompanying European explorers, and a couple of the Wainwrights, Joseph Wainwright, even accompanied Livingstone's body when he was to be buried in London. And some of these became some of the best traveled Africans probably anywhere in the 19th century, having accompanied European explorers and serving as translators. And some of them, their names, like Sidi Mubarak, Bombay, Matthew Wellington, and others. The Seychelles is a particularly fascinating place to research. In large part, they begin to arrive in 1861. And in contrast to the Atlantic, when the transatlantic slave trade essentially comes to an end in 1867, when photography is still in its infancy, photography is alive and well as the Indian Ocean continues through the late 19th century. And so photography is used not only for the large groups of captives who are then handed over to missionary groups, and then those images can be used to help build up subscriptions. But many of the captured vessels that were taken in the 1860s to the Seychelles involved groups of captives that were then later photographed, not as a group, but actually individually. And so this is the only site in the Indian Ocean and possibly the world where liberated Africans were individually photographed. And some of them are very haunting photos of very young children. Some of them are so small you can even see the chair that they're sitting on. I'll show you a couple of these. So these are in the Seychelles National Archives, but you can see some of them. You can actually see the chair that they're sitting on because they're so young. And they're haunting photographs of mostly children. And they date from the 1870s in particular. The Church Missionary Society also established a mission on the Seychelles, and they created a place called Venstown, where liberated African children were rounded up from various plantations and then put to work producing things like vanilla and learning manual industrial skills, just as they would do at other industrial schools. And in the Seychelles, you can visit the ruins of Venstown to this day. Aden also received large numbers of liberated Africans, particularly in the 1860s. So large groups of captives off of the coast of East Africa were taken to Aden in large numbers, particularly in the late 1860s. Large groups of them were photographed, and so the HMS Daphne photo that you saw, these were also popularized in Sullivan's very popular book. These are based on authentic photographs from the period. And large groups were photographed rather regularly in the Indian Ocean. They're unfortunately sometimes mislabeled in studies of the transatlantic slave trade as being groups of captives from the Atlantic. They're not. They're from the Indian Ocean. But we also have the logbooks of these ships, and sometimes logbooks are quite helpful because we can actually see the exact places where these ships were captured and then know a bit more perhaps about the routes that they were taking. And they also provide useful information about those people who never arrived at Aden, because they passed away en route. And sometimes just a small note in the logbook would indicate this one departed this life, one slave woman, committed body to the deep. So we know the precise location where this woman who passed away before she arrived in Aden would have been laid to rest at sea by ships like these. There's a really fascinating study, a microhistorical study that's been done, or prosopography that's been done by Sandy Shell called Children of Hope. And it's based on a group of 50 liberated Africans who were taken from these 3 ships that are in our database that were taken to Aden. And they were then indentured, or handed out to local residents, I should say, by Colonel Stace, who published this notice, which is common to the English notices that were made in Mauritius and elsewhere, basically saying, Alan, it means announcement. The freed slaves who have recently arrived in Aden are now available to be taken. And so it breaks it down into 4 categories. If you're a Christian and you're married, you can have men and women. If you're a Muslim, you can... Anyway, there's a sort of breakdown. But essentially, people are basically given out, just as they were done by the collectors of customs at Mauritius and the Cape of Good Hope. But 50 of these children were then given over to the Scottish Free Church Mission, the Keith Falconer Mission at Aden, and they were then subsequently transported to South Africa, to Lovedale. And Sandy Shell tells this really wonderful source. But I've had a look at Stace's original records. You can see all the requests that came in from all these British officials, the postmaster and the person in the telegraph office. I mean, everybody wants to get some liberated Africans, and you can see to whom they're given. And so fascinating to me, even A.C. Gomez, probably the best known photographer in Zanzibar in the 19th century, who gave us so many beautiful photographs of the Swahili coast, actually gets one liberated African girl at Aden from this same group that Sandy writes about. And you wonder, did she accompany him to Zanzibar? Is she in one of these photographs? I have to know. So Sandy Shell takes the story of these 50 liberated Africans, follows them all the way, in her book, Children of Hope, all the way to South Africa, and tells the story of what happens to them when they arrive at Lovedale. Other liberated Africans are taken to Mombasa, where the British establish another CMS mission called Freertown. They relocate some of the original Bombay Africans from the Nasik, Saharanpur asylum, and take them to Mombasa. Tragically, within a decade, many of them are suffering horrible abuse from a lay minister by the name of Streeter, who beat many of them in order to get confessions for crimes that they had allegedly committed. And it caused a great scandal for the CMS, just as some of these other missions experienced similar kinds of abuse. And I think we have to understand this in the broader context of the the vulnerability of these liberated Africans, having been removed from their kin and then having also been removed from the enslaved context by the British and taken to this equally unfamiliar and foreign place. They're incredibly vulnerable in these places, and so sadly, some of the people who are drawn to work with them in Christian contexts end up being abusive. Liberated Africans are taken to Zanzibar in large number. These include even Pedro Quilekwa, who I think is the only liberated African to actually be audio interviewed. And there's an interview with Pedro Quilekwa that was done in southeastern Africa, and it's actually a recording is in the British Library. It was among one of these liberated Africans. And the final one I'll just close with is Muscat, and this is a story that actually appears in my first book. A small number of liberated Africans were taken to Muscat, where they were given over to the RCA, the Reformed Church in America's mission. The Reformed Church in America is what we call the Dutch Reformed Church, and they had a small mission in Muscat, where they received 16 of these original liberated Africans taken off of a slave ship. And one of them, number 15, his name is Hajibu, but in Swahili that means he doesn't reply, he doesn't respond. And probably it was the other boys saying he's deaf, essentially, right? He is, and we know that he actually was, so that's probably not his birth name, but they're basically communicating. So they're all given Christian names, and many of them end up being given over to RCA missionaries who are working around the Gulf when the mission closes down a few years later. And one of them, you can see by the name of Suleiman, number 2, he takes the name Solomon, and he's given over to the Zwemmer family, and they're in Bahrain. Years later, Zwemmer, who's teaching at Princeton Seminary, runs into him in New York City, and he seeks Zwemmer out, Solomon does, because he wants to get authentication that he is a British subject, because he wants to return to the place of his birth, which was Zanzibar. So they're photographed also to build up subscriptions for their mission, and so Solomon is one of these boys at the Freed Slave School in Muscat. So I have a chapter in Henry Lovejoy and Richard Anderson's book on this, in which I cover some of this. If you're interested to see that, the rest of the information is there. But what I'm interested in following the broader project is just the life experiences of these individuals, but also collectively as a group, how is it that liberated Africans are treated? And I'm tracking over the course of the 19th century that the treatment is always poor. There's a lot of abuse. There's a lot of, and I trace this back to, I think, changes that are happening in European perceptions of race and the adoption of scientific racism in the 19th century, which I hope to talk to you more about in the future. Thanks very much.
All right. I believe we have some time for question. And so there are microphones in both aisles. And yeah, welcome any all questions for either of our papers. Yeah.
Thanks a lot for all these wonderful presentations. I have a question for Matt. This is very low. You mentioned that indenture lasted up to 14 years. Do you have any sense of what happened afterwards? I know that the rhetoric around indenture was often also to educate them and help them ease the transition into slavery. Was that at all accomplished?
Are we taking multiple? Should I just respond? Should I just respond now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, go right.
Yeah, thanks. There's some documentation from Mauritius and the Cape of Good Hope that indicates some people did complete a 14-year contract and were given paperwork to indicate that their indenture was now finished. And there's been some interesting microhistorical work, biographical work done by historians of Mauritius. So Marina Carter, Sue Peabody, Satyendra Peertham, and Clara Boyer have all done sort of longitudinal studies of individuals, who have actually completed or in one way or another left indenture. And some of them end up owning property, they end up having families, and their descendants are still alive to this day. So Clara Boyer in particular has done this really interesting study of a group of captives aboard one ship called the Jose, which was captured by the HMS Lily. And fascinatingly, many of those captives took Lily as their surname, and they have descendants today. So in Mauritius, people will come up to me and say, "Oh, you need to meet my friend, so whose last name is Lily," right? Who are descended from some of those original captives in Jose. And Clara's been successful in bringing them to an exhibition that she did at the Intercontinental Slave Museum. So I think there have been some exciting studies that are biographical, and I think that's really the future. I think that's really a a great direction for future work, and I'd love to go there as well.
And we should mention that the local Mauritian who was responsible for interviewing these men and one woman, or at least a couple of women, also took life masks. And she's been very successful in terms of putting names and faces together. So this is one of those rare occasions when we can look upon the face of the individual that is being discussed. Absolutely. Yep.
Thank you all for a great panel. Questions for Jane, and it's kind of a methodological or source question, because I was thinking during your talk, which was fascinating, about a challenge that I run into in the intra-American database of trying to quantify patterns in terms of resistance or other shipboard experiences, where I worry sometimes that the patterns I might be seeing are shaped more by the kinds of sources I looked at for different ports rather than being shaped by any historical reality. So we often have a lot of data from ports where we have unbroken series of port records. And that's rich in terms of giving us a lot of voyages and a strong sense of just the patterns of who's arriving and when, but those sources almost never tell us anything about resistance or shipboard experiences. It's just on this date, this ship arrived with this number of people on board. And then it's for other ports where we don't have those records that I sometimes resort to more qualitative kinds of records, the correspondence of merchants or things like that, where you're more likely to hear people say, well, we had this voyage, the ship arrived, but we didn't get all the people we were expecting to have because there was an uprising at sea and things like that. But we don't have those kinds of descriptive sources for everywhere. So I'm just wondering how you think about that kind of methodological question and how it might shape the patterns you're seeing in your data.
Yeah, I think it's completely shaping the patterns in the data. And again, we are still at the very beginnings of this database. And since we are building a lot of this on the work of others, we are also very restricted by what they choose to include. So I should say that a lot of our information for Asia is coming out of a partnership, a group in the Netherlands that's been putting together this data. And I suspect that most of the researchers were not interested in resistance. Or not cataloging it in the ways in which we catalog things, right? But I think also talking about the port issue, this is why I feel pretty confident talking about Madagascar, because it's mostly my work. And I looked at ship log books in which I looked at Dutch, French, and British log books and some American correspondence. And it's very clear, even French ships that go to Western Madagascar experience higher incidence of resistance than the ones on Eastern, right? So that helps me feel a bit more confident about that data. But we need somebody to go in and look for comparable data in like East Africa, for instance. Because as you saw, like Capella, as far as I know, doesn't, except for the really large uprisings that are successful, like the Merman that comes to everyone's attention, we don't know a lot about most of these uprisings. Most of them are the cases in which there's 5 people that attempt to plot. They might kill a few enslaved people might be killed. And I'm guessing that a lot of times the captains don't even record this information. And it becomes even worse in the illegal era that Matt is referring to, because there's fewer documents even for that era. So if the bulk of our voyages are coming from the kind of later part of the slave trade in the Indian Ocean, into the 19th century, we know that there was resistance from interviews with slave captains into the 1820s, 1830s, and so on. But they're not going to disclose, and then there's a big uprising and we have to kill people, right, in logbooks that we can find. So I think that it's going to continue to be an issue. And if you come up with a way to handle this in the Americas, let me know, because maybe we can come up with some ideas. But I think at the very least, though, and I had a great quotation, and my computer wouldn't load, so I couldn't find the quotation for you all, but that David Richardson says about we cannot minimize the fact that there was significant resistance on board these vessels, right? And this is a really important concept that I think we need to share when we talk about the slave trade. People say, why did people not overthrow the vessel? Why, and so on. And we need to call attention to resistance whenever we see it, at least. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Jorge Felipe here. I have a question for Jane and Matthew and for the whole panel. So 3 questions. The first one is, if I remember correctly, David Richardson, in his article on slave rebellions, he identified some patterns of a correlation between the size of the ship and the frequency of a slave rebellion. Have you found that in the western side of Madagascar? So the second question is for Matthew, I mean, your sources are like just mind-blowing. It's incredible. But one of the sources, there is a drawing, what seems to be an African testifying in front of the mixed commission court. There is an image, there is an African, and there is something looking like a court, and there is a desk. Is that like a mixed commission court drawing? And my third question is something that I've been thinking a lot about. When you look at the distinction that Philip Cortin did for the different regions in Africa, starting in Senegambia, then Southeast Africa, which is used in the database, immediately after West Central Africa, there is a gap, which is what is now South Africa, and then you move to the Southeast Africa. We know that South Africa became the destination of liberated Africans. There were shipwrecks there. Why wasn't South Africa or that region more involved in shipping Africans to the Americas? Or, since this is right in the middle between both oceans, what was going on in South Africa that didn't become an important slave imports in the transatlantic slave trade?
It was incredibly important.
That's
yeah.
actually good.
So I think what our database is going to show is that we have, there's a lot of voyages that call at the Cape, often sell a few people, and then go on to the Americas, right? So I think the Cape actually, in the ways in which we look at the transatlantic slave trade database, like this image up there, we minimize the significance of the Cape. It was key in provisioning ships. They also were net importers of Africans and Asians as laborers in Malagasy as well. So I think that's one thing that'll come out of our research, is that it really does kind of bring together the two places. Yeah.
I follow a question very quickly. If being that the case, what category are you going to use geographically? Because we have a gap.
Yeah. This is why there's going to be one database.
South Africa, nothing between.
Yeah.
Have you guys talked about a category in order to add it to the transatlantic slave trade database or to other databases?
I mean, it's an excellent question. I think it's one we're going to keep on grappling with when we get into the Pacific and when we get into other parts. This is why there's one database, I think. And essentially, I think some of these, it shows that these geographical designations are not very useful. I mean, I think Richard was showing that. I want to return to your first question. So that's a bigger question. There's a lot of categories I could have used for analysis. So how many captives were on board a vessel? Clearly crucial. There's a reason why I looked at number of voyages, and that is because we have not done the work to be able to identify. Like, we have to clean up the data. We have to do some various impute scripts and so on. Like, we are not at a place where I could have done that for this research, but I think that would be incredibly important to do. Likewise, number of days on coast, I think, are crucial. Gender proportions on board these vessels, like how many men versus how many women. Like there's a lot of variables that we should have looked at, that I could look at for this, but I just couldn't yet. So I kind of took what I could, which is looking at geography and chronology. But your point is well taken. I think that likely there were larger vessels in Western Madagascar, but I would need to have the hard data. So hopefully like a year from now, when we have the database going, I can do that.
Thank you.
May I add something here? I mean, one of the problems that anyone who works on slavery and slave trading in the Indian Ocean has to appreciate is that we do not have the evidentiary base that you have in the Atlantic. This is a point that Hubert Gerbeau raised in an article back in 1979. And another point that he made too, and this brings us back to how do these oceanic realms relate to one another. In part of the title of an article, he started off by saying, "L'océan Indien n'est pas l'Atlantique." The Indian Ocean is not the Atlantic. There are obvious similarities. All of us would agree that we have been inspired by the transatlantic slave trade days, by David's work and the work of others. But part of this discussion is to appreciate that there are significant differences. And it brings us back to the complexities of this system it is a global system of the movement of chattel labor. Just to add an additional point, I mean, Jane mentioned she's been working with about 3,000 voyages right now. I'm currently in the process of consolidating, all of this stuff for the Mascarenes. We also have a colleague, Hideaki Suzuki, who has about 230 outstanding voyages for the Gulf. And so I think by the time we get around to inaugurating this thing, we're probably, as I mentioned earlier, I think we're going to be around 4,000 voyages, perhaps more. And I guess the point that I would like to everybody keep in mind is that when we take a look at the transatlantic slave trade database, we're talking 50 years of work by a multiplicity of people. We're talking about a handful in the Indian Ocean, and the significant work that's been done has been done basically within the last 10 years by people who weren't thinking about the bigger picture. And so the point that I would emphasize, and Daniel mentioned this the other day, is that we see this as establishing a foundation upon which others are going to be able to build. But I would say to you quite honestly, we're never, ever going to have 36,500 in the Indian Ocean and Asia because the evidence doesn't exist. We have a lot of Asian scholars, for example, who deny that slavery ever occurred. And this is true, I mean, in China, for example. Claude Chevalier, right, is currently actually sketching out the framework of internal slave trading networks within the Middle Kingdom, which connect to, for example, Macau, and so forth and so on. So I think that as we talk about this, this is something, if you're looking for an immediate one-to-one comparison with the Atlantic, it doesn't exist, it never will exist, but that doesn't diminish the fact that the information that we have, when it's used correctly and thoughtfully, can provide us with a sense of the dynamics of this truly global system. And again, I cannot emphasize this enough. We know, for example, that African slaves are carried to Manila. We know that they arrive in Macau. We know that they're in Nagasaki. We know that Europeans carry Chinese and Korean and Japanese slaves from Manila across the Pacific to Mexico, Acapulco, and Peru. So an integral part of what drives me, and if I'm passionate about it, it's because I've been doing this for 50 years, right? It's to appreciate that when we talk certainly about European activity, and this is where we're going to have the best evidence, let's just accept that fact, we're talking here about something which is truly global in scope. Obviously, the Atlantic is exceptionally important because we happen to have this extraordinary wealth of data. But that's not to say that what's going on in the Indian Ocean or the Pacific isn't. Because again, it brings us back to this larger question of slavery as a global phenomenon. And it's only when we appreciate the true globality of it that we can begin to appreciate that what happens here in the Atlantic, yes, it has some very distinctive features, but it's not unique.
I'll be really quick. That photo is from the Vice Admiralty Court at Zanzibar. There's only one Court of Mixed Commission. It's very brief, and Chris Saunders calls it uses the word farce in a title of an article he wrote, but it's at the Cape of Good Hope. It's established in 1839. It only handles a small number of cases. But all the other ones are Vice Admiralty courts, and that image is from Zanzibar.
So it's a mixed commission drawing.
Yeah, it's sort of like a,
It's like a representation.
Yeah, exactly.
Idealized. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, you got one? Oh, and then one, and then.
Yes.
Hi, thank you. So, Cesar Fortes Lima. Yesterday I was talking about the Nueva Marron communities. They create a community from the slave trade period until today. And also about the liberate Africans from Santa Elena. But in Santa Elena, they didn't create a community. Most of the descendants in Santa Elena today are not descendants from the liberate Africans. So I'm wondering if in the Indian Ocean you could find examples of communities created during the slave trade period until today.
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah.
I think what I heard was whether or not they, if there are community examples in the Indian Ocean of communities that were created during the trade because of the trade in part, right? So similar to in St. Helena in the Atlantic, the liberated Africans who were dropped off there formed a community on the island, and are there similar kind of communities that formed because of the trade in the Ocean? If I got it right.
Right. Yeah, so I think very briefly, the answer is both. So I think there are lots of examples of integration where people just become part of the broader community, and some examples of people staying together as a unique community themselves. So I mentioned the case of the Lily Africans who kept a distinct surname. But one thing I just wanted to highlight is it's easy for us in the 21st century to look at what happens to liberated Africans and say, this is really the British, in an ironic way, taking an advantage of their labor. It looks to us a lot like slavery. It is certainly coercive labor, and it looks to me like slavery as well. People are doing the very same work that enslaved people were doing, but at least in Mauritius in as early as 1815, being a liberated African was seen as a clearly distinct category. And it was actually a desirable category if you were enslaved and working on somebody's sugar plantation. So there are examples of people absconding. Jane's seen lots of these as well. Yeah. People absconding from slavery and then presenting themselves to the police or the collector of customs as if they've been newly imported, because they want to be received as a liberated African and registered, because they would rather be indentured for 14 years as a liberated African than to continue to be enslaved. So that tells us there is clearly a distinction, right? Even though it looks the same to us, to them it was an important enough distinction.
Thank you.
Free Negro children in the South whose parents died were often put in relationships of indenture. Thank you. Free Negro children whose parents died in the American South were often put in official legal relations of indenture, by definition, therefore, for specific lengths of time, and then freed. Something I'm surprised at, I only recently found out tracing someone's family tree. When, Jane, I'm interested, Oprah famously wanted to be Zulu, right? I had to break her heart and tell her. And you talked about liberated people stopping in South Africa. Is there evidence that, Zulu or Xhosa people, I can't say it,
Yeah.
were enslaved and made it to the New World?
That's a hard one. I mean, so the problem, and I think this gets into a lot of other people's work as well, just because we know where somebody came from the port doesn't mean we know where they're from in Africa.
Right.
And there's been some really interesting work by South Africans saying that in the midst of the Mfukane, so some of the battles that are coming out of South Africa, there was a rise in captives out of Southeast Africa. So I would hazard a guess that there are people that ended up in the Americas, or especially in the Indian Ocean as well, but also into the Americas from Southern Africa, just because they were wrapped up in conflicts and then exported. Mm-hmm. But I don't have any direct evidence because we don't have any slaving ports right there around the Zulu region of Southern Africa.
Mm-hmm. Richard?
Yeah, the information we have right now, and I mean, the first and the best indicator of ethnicity for cargoes destined to the mass screens is the 1817 Mauritian slave census. And so you go through that, and I've been through about 1,000 of the entries. I mean, it's 8 volumes like that. You need a forklift, right, to bring them out. Has allowed me, with Ned Alper's help and Pierre Larson's help, to identify 14 populations in what is now, that we would recognize as modern populations in southeastern Africa, eastern Africa, Makua, Makonde, Ngindu, so forth and so on. Some of which, of course, extend as far inland as southern Malawi and eastern Zambia. Mm-hmm. And then we have 14 sort of ethno-cultural communities in Madagascar. The criteria for distinguishing them, I guess we leave in the hands of our anthropological colleagues. But I've never, ever seen anything which suggests that we get people, at least before the 19th century, from the areas up there in Natal, being fed into these slave trading networks. Mm-hmm. Simply because, I mean, the activity is concentrated on Portuguese-controlled ports. Mm-hmm. And so the southernmost of that, of course, is probably going to be Sofala. Mm-hmm. And whether they actually tap in, I mean, I'll leave it to my Portuguese specialist friends, right, to possibly tease something out of that. But I mean, one of the things that makes, for example, the Mascarenes so extraordinarily interesting is that of all of the European colonies in the world, I've argued, and I think the case can be made, that the Mascarenes draw upon the single largest global catchment area of any other place, any other European colony. We have people from West Africa who are described generically as Guineans, but also more specifically as Bambara and Wolof. We have these 14 populations, as well as others we don't know, we can't find a modern equivalent in southeastern Africa and along the Swahili coast. We have people coming out of the Horn. We have people coming out of the Persian Gulf. We have any number of peoples coming out of South Asia. The same thing, at least 6 islands in the Indonesian archipelago, Java, Sumatra, Nias, so forth and so on. And we even have people who are described as Chinese. So it brings us back again to, you know, one of the things that helps to make at least the Mascarenes distinctive is it's truly, it reaches all over. And it again underscores the fact that we can't really distinguish or draw the sharp line we have hitherto between the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. Because again, that undermines, I mean, the initial slaves, for example, that come to Mascarenes, greatest number are coming from West Africa, coming out of places like Gore and Ouida.
I think
Things change.
One other issue that didn't really come up in the panel yesterday on DNA is we also have to be careful not to telescope back too far in time, some of these ethnonyms, right? That don't exist as such before the 19th century. So anyway, this...
It would, I'm sorry I couldn't be here. I had to be in New York yesterday. But if you have looked at any of the, well, 23andMe is in suspended animation right now, but also in Ancestry DNA, there are categories for Mozambique and Madagascar, too, for mutations, so that you can see, I think, Cory Booker, of all people, I think had mutations shared with people from Madagascar. Don't quote me on that, but I could let you know. But 2 or 3 prominent people have had small degrees of Mozambican and I'm trying to make an adjectival form of Madagascarian or whatever it is.
Yeah.
The other thing you might look at is our database called the Image of the Black and Western Art. 26,000 images, which are housed at the Hutchins Center and at the Warburg Institute in London, if you happen to be there. And we've published 11 volumes with Harvard University Press. But there's a zillion more transparencies for images of Negroid people, as we used to say, in India, Japan. You know, I would look at them and say, where the hell do these people come from? You know, and they figure, well, they had to be enslaved, and you're helping us to understand how. But it's very interesting. If we could collate the DNA evidence, the shipping evidence, and the image of the black evidence, I mean, that's 3 amazing databases that could be collated that reinforce each other. None is definitive, but they're all illustrative and enhancing.
Definitely.
I mean,
Daniel, did you have a question, Daniel?
Somebody should ask a question of Gabriel, too.
Yeah. I wanna, have you ever heard about the Makuas of Durban?
Yeah. Prebends or?
They self-identify as a community of liberated Africans from Mozambique, from the Makua group in Mozambique, in Durban, South Africa, right? And so that goes back to what he was saying, right? And the other point I'd like to just run by you is, how about the cities in India? Could we also view them as sort of not exactly the same sort of liberated Africans that you were discussing, but also a community that emerged out of slavery and living in the heart of India?
Yeah, definitely. And Daniel mentioned, so Preben Karstholm has done some really interesting work in the Journal of African History on this group of liberated Africans, their descendants. So there are times when being a liberated African can actually have some very significant sort of financial consequences, right? So this is the area that was reserved for these liberated Africans who were, they call themselves Zanzibari or Makua, yeah. They have now this really, the area that was designated was actually now a very desirable area for real estate. And so that can have a very serious, being a member of that community can have a very serious implication. And so it's an interesting article to read because there's some contest about who should be included in that community. Yeah, that's a great example.
Could I come back to the issue, just very briefly, point of clarification? I just wanted to mention Don Wyatt's work on blacks in China. And there's every indication that these are enslaved Africans who reached there as early as the 9th or 10th century. So that again speaks to the depth, chronological depth of the 9th and 10th century. Yes.
Tatiana, do you have-
You should ask your question.
Yeah, we got time for one more.
Sorry, everybody's exhausted.
No. Oh, no, we need the microphone for the recording.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I just wanted to congratulate you. This has been like a dream of mine since I was in graduate school, trying to quantify the trans-Pacific slave trade. And I just wanted to confirm your geographical scope. It might seem like it's so gigantic, right, from Mozambique all the way to the Philippines. My heart's always kind of in Manila. But, historically, the periodization of the Atlantic slave trade and all of these slave trades does converge from very early on. There are people in Manila from what we now call Mozambique and Madagascar and, all over from India. So there really has been these long-standing links. But I wanted to ask a question for Gabriel. Gabriel, you are doing such important work. I know it's also it's a lot of heavy lifting. But I wanted you to tell us a little bit about your dissertation, because I know you're finishing it. How is this being useful for you in terms of writing new history?
So I'm in my second year, so I'm not finishing. Yeah, so I'm having some inspiration because I work with West Central Africa, which is very different from the slave trade in East Africa, but it's really making me compare the slave trade between both regions of Africa and the functioning of the slave trade in these different regions has enriched me so much in this process, and it has made me see, it's making me see that at the same time that we have some similarities, we have some specificities that force us in this part of the slave trade in the Indian Ocean to see this slave trade as itself, but also in relationship with the transatlantic. So it's there is some it's autonomous, but there is some correlation. And it's very interesting to think, because mainly for Mozambique. Mozambique was a port city that was engaged both in the transatlantic and the Indian Ocean. So it's very interesting to see the perspectives of this research on how watching the slave trade in a port like this can make us understand how both slave trades, both systems, they overlap. So I think that's a little bit about how it has interested me so much, all these comparisons that I have been able to do.
Maybe we'll bring you over to the Indian Ocean like we brought Daniel over as well.
Yeah. Well, I think we should thank this panel again for a wonderful session. Absolutely.